The abundant facts make it abundantly clear that Donald Trump is a fascist and is a threat to the democratic republic that is the United States. And any principled person who pays attention to politics should recognize that, and if they're an eligible voter, vote for the candidate who stands the best chance of defeating Trump. And yet you have Republican politicians and conservative commentators who traffic in politics professionally who say that they're men of conscience. They say that they don't like Donald Trump, they prefer somebody else to Donald Trump, but they can't bring themselves to vote for a Democrat, especially President Biden, because he too and they too pose a threat to democracy. And I have two people in mind who say these things: conservative commentator Ben Shapiro and former Republican Congressman Peter Meyer, who is now running for Michigan's Senate seat. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. All right, folks, so this one is really frustrating, okay? We've discussed this in previous videos in terms of the overall theme that Trump is a fascist and a threat to democracy, and we're going to keep talking about it until at least the 2024 election, because you and I and everybody else should be shouting it from the rooftops. It's not a minor piece of trivia. It's profoundly important, infinitely more important than President Biden's age and, Ron DeSantis' heels, even though that's pretty funny. As a matter of fact, and we won't spend too much time on this, but The Economist, who has like a 30-year-old predictive guide to the next year. They've been doing this for year after year after year for 30 years. They predict that Donald Trump poses the biggest danger to the world in 2024. That's huge, something from as nonpartisan as The Economist. And they go into vivid detail as to why the impact, that a second Trump presidency would have on the international order. But even domestic politics, the fact that he's promised vengeance, the fact that he intends to populate his administration with loyalists who, where competency is not the value that they bring, but rather sheer partisan loyalty. People like Marjorie Taylor Greene instead of somebody like Bill Barr. Not saying that Bill Barr, I guess, was a colossal improvement, but that's the state of the game. Everybody's starting to wake up to this. And yet you have people like Ben Shapiro, okay? I don't like Ben Shapiro. There was a time when, from probably 2016, maybe at the end of the 2016 presidential election until like 2018-ish, 2019, where I was one of those debate bro contrarian leftists who was subsumed in right-wing debate culture because I wanted the left to actually have something like that. I had no idea, for example, that Sam Cedar existed. I had no idea that Kyle Kalinske and Michael Brooks and Destiny and Vosh, people like that existed, because the YouTube algorithm had funneled me down Ben Shapiro and Steven Crowder and the IDW, et cetera, and so forth. So I'm very familiar with Ben Shapiro. And I will say, as the Daily Wire has populated itself with much more fringe figures, people like Michael Knowles and Matt Walsh and Candace Owens, you might be tempted to think, well, Ben Shapiro is kind of sane. And I suppose relative to his compatriots in his immediate circle, he is. And yet, you have things like this. So we're going to play this clip in which at the Oxford Union in the United Kingdom, Shapiro is challenged basically to defend the proposition that how, when push comes to shove, can you back Biden over Trump?
Why do you
Or rather, Trump over Biden.
Let's say Trump wins. Why do you not come out and support Biden? Because you clearly don't like Biden, right? And everyone has their own political views. But Trump seems to me to be a fundamentally serious threat to American democracy, which Biden simply isn't. So Trump's called for the suspension of the Constitution, and he's facilitated an insurrection. Biden's done neither of those things. He's been fairly milquetoast president. So why don't you endorse Biden?
So I disagree with some of the premises of the question. So number one, as far as Donald Trump being a serious danger to democracy, I think in the best of his imaginations, he probably would be in many ways. But this constitutional system is extremely durable. January 6th was not, in fact, a serious threat to American democracy. It was a serious threat to American order. It was not a serious threat to American democracy. There was no point in time on January 6th where there was a real possibility that a military coup had been launched and Donald Trump would retain the presidency after January 6th. It just was not going to happen. So the institutions of the United States and the legal institutions remain quite strong, and we're able to hem in whatever Donald Trump's peculiar desires are on the one hand. On the other hand, there are different types of threats to democracy. So Joe Biden, for example, has used the power of the executive branch in new and exorbitant ways. Most obviously, for example, when he tried to use OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety Administration, he tried to use that to cram down, for example.
So the clip freezes for whatever reason, and I don't know how much longer it freezes, but we've got the follow-up to it. Again, we're gonna finish that clip and then we'll unpack it.
actual policies of Donald Trump, the stuff that he actually did as president, not the crazy tweets and the nutty stuff that he says all the time, but in what he did in terms of the economy, what he did in terms of foreign policy, I'm obviously much more in alignment with his actual political positions than I am with Joe Biden. As far as the threat to democracy, as I say, one is more subtle and one is more obvious, and in some cases the more obvious is actually the easier to reject.
Well, I don't know. This position seems quite strange to me because you've essentially conceded that Trump does not believe in American democracy. He doesn't believe in American institutions. But
I think he believes in Trump and pretty much nothing else. Yes, I think he believes in Donald Trump and not much else.
Yeah, precisely. But okay, sure, he might not be able to create the Trump dictatorship, but is it really healthy for a democracy to have a leader in charge who does not believe in any of America's institutions? You know, say what you like about Biden, but he is proudly American. He believes in the institutions of America. Surely you should support him over this egomaniac.
Well, I mean, I don't think he actually believes in some of the institutions. I mean, he's attacked the Supreme Court would be a good example. He's attacked the Supreme Court with alacrity in the aftermath of the overruling of Roe versus Wade, for example. His party has talked about packing the Supreme Court. When it comes to the use of
He's not packing it, though.
His party has talked about it, right? You're right, he has not. And Donald Trump talked about a lot of stuff, and that hasn't materialized either. So again, would I prefer that all of these candidates go away? Absolutely.
So then, of course, he indulges in this. Well, I mean, I don't prefer Trump, which he doesn't. He prefers Governor Ron DeSantis in the Republican primary, but he's made it abundantly clear that if push comes to shove, he'll back Trump over Biden. But all of that was just nonsense. It was just muddying the water. So number one, we know for a fact that Donald Trump is literally, legally, in the eyes of the justice system in the United States, an insurrectionist. The Colorado judge, which recently decided that he could still stay on the ballot, also conceded Trump is literally an insurrectionist, number one. So that's a distinction that Biden does not enjoy. Trump is an insurrectionist. Biden is not. Biden is therefore, at least so far, infinitely morally superior than Donald Trump. But number two, the way that Ben speaks of political institutions and civic institutions almost he speaks with this almost like they're divinely crafted and divinely enforced, like just God himself or angels or some sort of supernatural creature has enshrined these American institutions and has made them invincible to fascists like Donald Trump. It's not true. Civic institutions, democratic institutions, government institutions, period, here in the United States, elsewhere, all throughout history, and here until the end of time, are enforced through norms and reciprocity. People in those institutions believing that the institution should run a certain way. That's how institutions have crumbled, historically speaking, is because a particularly charismatic demagogue is able to persuade those who run those institutions to, value his primacy over the institutions themselves. So this idea that because the institutions held with Donald Trump's first clumsy, rough draft attempt to overthrow them, therefore we don't need to worry about them, is insane, because that's his implicit argument. This idea that Trump failed this one time, the institutions held, so let's do it again. It's almost like people talk about guardrails. Well, let's think of literal guardrails on a highway, right? If somebody drives 60, 70 miles per hour into a guardrail and the guardrail holds, but it's warped and bent, Ben Shapiro would never say, okay, somebody else get in a car and just drive at it again because they held the first time. The same logic applies. He's bending over backwards to accommodate a Republican because he knows that he can't actually defend the proposition in good faith. Donald Trump is indeed a fascist and a threat to democracy, and he knows that Joe Biden simply isn't. And even if I granted him that Joe Biden was in some way, Donald Trump is infinitely worse. Ben Shapiro is determined to lose. Like it's preordained. No matter how he carries down this argument, he would lose that particular debate. And he lost that particular debate to the young man in question because the young man also points out, okay, well, how has Joe Biden threatened democracy? And Ben Shapiro moves the goalpost again. He said, well, he uses executive power in exorbitant ways. Like Donald Trump didn't. Donald Trump hoarded executive power. President Obama hoarded executive power. It is a problem that is bipartisan. But what has Joe Biden done exactly? Well, he tried to use OSHA to enforce vaccine mandates. Except when it was challenged in court and the court overruled him, Joe Biden complied. President Biden complied with the courts. So where's the threat? Well, his party has talked about packing the Supreme Court. Well, as this young man points out, Joe Biden hasn't tried to pack the Supreme Court. As a matter of fact, he has repeatedly and publicly said he opposes packing the Supreme Court. And then, notice the sleight of hand, Shapiro says, well, his party's talked about it. Okay, well, Joe Biden is not his party. Joe Biden, at least from an institutionalist perspective, if that's your priority, Joe Biden has checked the more progressive elements of his party who want him to change the institution. I actually disagree with President Biden very often in that respect. I think institutions do need to change when they've been abused in the way that they have by Republicans, but he has been such a stalwart institutionalist. He has rejected calls to do that. So actually that's proof that based on your logic, he is not a threat to democracy, again, in ways that Trump simply is. So it's just absolute bad faith from Shapiro. But it goes beyond that. You got Peter Meyer, who is a Republican congressman who served one term. He was elected in 2020, was inaugurated in 2021. And even though he supported Trump in 2020, in 2021, after the January 6th insurrection, he voted to impeach Donald Trump. Okay, he was one of 10 Republicans in the House of Representatives to do so. He suffered a primary challenger in the 2022 midterms, lost, and now he's planning a comeback. And we're not going to read this whole article, but this is a Politico interview. And the interviewer pointed out less than a year ago, Peter Meyer told me, this is from the author, that he couldn't imagine voting for Trump in 2024. And again, this was after he impeached him. At the time, he was leaving Congress after a single term, having voted to impeach Trump. Now he's launching a comeback for the Senate, and he's changing his tune. And again, we're not going to read the whole thing, but he says, listen, something I've grappled with. I think Bill Barr's response has been, I'll jump off that bridge when it comes to it. I would say one of the things that's really changed between now and then is my frustration at the cynical calculation I've seen from the Democratic side. Okay, so basically he's saying that, he doesn't like the Democratic tactics to unseat Donald Trump. And again, it goes on and on and on. He says here at the very bottom that... he puts it pretty bluntly here at the bottom. I guess we'll just conclude then. He's like, so the interviewer says, during his presidential campaign, former Vice President Mike Pence said that anyone who puts himself above the Constitution should never be president of the United States. Agree or disagree? Actually, no, let me read this part too. I forgot about this. Is that as dramatic as January 6th? He's talking about what he perceives to be President Biden's failures. He says, no. Do I think it will have far more insidious and dangerous repercussions in the long term? Absolutely. So he's talking about policy. He's talking about what he perceives to be a poorly enforced southern border. Okay, well, that's a policy disagreement. And by the way, the president doesn't craft immigration policy. That's up to Congress. The president can only enforce. And as we've discussed, the manpower, the policies, the resources under the Biden administration at the southern border have been absolutely commensurate with what was there under Donald Trump. So if he wants things to change, he has to get Congress to do it. So then, to that question about what Mike Pence said, somebody who puts himself above the Constitution, Meyer says, I would largely agree. The challenge becomes if you have two individuals who've done so, there's a lot more shades of gray. Biden has done so in less dramatic ways, and he's gotten much more of a pass from the media on it. I always play a fun game where it's like, okay, how would the media reaction be if Trump was the one doing these exact same things? I'm frustrated by this dynamic quite a bit. So Peter Meyer takes the position that actually the media is giving Biden a pass, that Biden is actually also a threat to democracy. And if Trump were doing the things that Biden were doing, the media would be freaking out. Like what? He doesn't actually give an example. He just gives examples of policies with which he disagrees. But as we've discussed, the media has a bias that favors Trump. They grade Republicans on a curve. And so throughout this entire interview, he just says, listen, Trump is ham-fisted, Trump is clumsy, Trump is dramatic. That's the threat he poses. But Biden poses a much more subtle threat. That's what Ben Shapiro said. None of these people can defend that proposition. All they do is cite examples of policy that they disagree with, legitimate areas of dispute. Again, trying to, enforce vaccine mandates via OSHA. That was struck down in the courts. Biden respected the decision. You disagree with Biden's enforcement at the southern border. Again, legitimate policy disagreement. How does that constitute a threat to the Democratic Republic in a way that Donald Trump did? Donald Trump tried to litigate his way into a second term after losing an election. He would not commit to a peaceful transfer of power. He riled up a mob to attack the Capitol to delay the certification of votes. He contemplated invoking the Insurrection Act to seize voting machines. He still hasn't conceded the election. He's plotted elaborate ways to strike revenge if he's granted a second term. Joe Biden, Democrats have done nothing like that. And yet you have these supposed people of principle, these supposed conservatives of conscience, because they know they can't possibly defend Trump next to Biden, with at least with respect to who poses a greater threat to democracy. They know they can't do that in good faith. They go out of their way to muddy the waters. This is absolutely gross. It's despicably bad faith. It's stupid, and it should be called out aggressively. Let me know what you think.